Hey there guys, this is Obsidian Show. Got another video for today. And a few days ago there was a video released by a well-known Might DPS on the US side called Coded Kills, who kind of broke down his artifact swap rotation that made Might DPS power sets very competitive against like a meta Prec DPS essentially. And then everyone started freaking out, or some people started freaking out. There's a post on the forums, I'll put it up here. The post was nuked by MEPS later, and then everyone freaked out that it was nuked and they weren't sure why, and so I thought I'd post it here. Let's talk about it. I mean, artifact swapping, there's always drama around it, so I figured we'll touch on it again. So the current meta consists of artifact swapping like crazy. I wouldn't say that's a meta. To this basically, I'll put that code of the video in the description too if you want to check it out, but I'll talk about some of it later as well. But I didn't mind at first, but now it feels like an exploit. Dead King Scepter swapped every 2 powers to reset the internal cooldown and orbital assistance, which should have a 30-second cooldown, but now it goes off every 4 seconds. The Mercy swap on pets, resetting the internal cooldown, which I've shown in videos. Piper can be procced without even being slotted. I've shown that in videos. Last pick can be reset, claw. So it's just general like art swapping and the effects lasting. So it's not a new topic. The thing is, what people need to understand is that artifacts right now are working as intended. So that doesn't mean that ideally the developers don't want certain artifacts to work a certain way. It's that they have limitations themselves because there is no tech available. From either when like Batuba started making artifacts, to when Sharon helped on some, to when Romaro took over on artifacts, and now I think it's going to be switched into another developer. Either way, it doesn't matter. The tech hasn't been available to them to create any kind of system where the effects don't last. So if that tech existed from the start, then we wouldn't have like artifacts like Cog or Tetra, etc., lasting their effects beyond the duration. But that tech isn't available, so the artifacts are working as intended. So that's why it's none of this has ever been an exploit. When you think of artifacts, like say when you think of like Dead King Scepter or Philosopher's Stone, these are not artifacts that are designed to be equipped the entire time. It'd be absolutely pointless, because once you use their supply drop, it's a useless artifact. You're just getting it for base stats at that point. You might as well swap it off. Same thing with Dead King Scepter. Now, the method that Coded showed, which I wasn't aware of, I hadn't thought to test that. So obviously now that changes slightly with Dead King Scepter, but same concept. I mean, you use your orbital, you get the cooldown proc. So if you're not going to swap like Coded does, then you're still using it on an orbital cooldown, lowers the cooldowns, and you take it off. Same thing with Mercy. If you're not a pet DPS, the only reason why you would use Mercy would be for the reactive field, because you don't care about anything else. You're not using it as a pet DPS. So, that's not an exploit. That's just how the artifact's designed and how you as a player are using it. So let's kind of give like some quick examples here. So if you're completely new to the subject, say for example, I put my mites at like 235. It'll be, let's put Tetra on. So now it's 238. So if I use a power, my mite's going to jump up from Tetra. So now if I take Tetra off, I'm still going to have that same buff. You're going to see a buff drop because it's going to be escalated might, but so it's going to drop again back to the 235 or 238. So I didn't have Tetra on, but I still had that buff might, because when I had Tetra on and used it, it increased my might. So I could take it off because the effect's already done. It's already there. So that's the same concept with like Claw and everything else. So once I hit Claw, it pots to the group with increased VIT and gives everyone the buffs. And then I can take it off. So yes, the topic of debate would be if those effects should last. And I think there's some artifacts where that certainly could be changed in the future if the tech was available from the developers. But that's the thing. If the tech isn't made from the developers, if they can't have that work in the system properly, then it's not going to change. I mean, obviously, if Batuba could have done it at the very start, he wouldn't have had pet damage count for either Gemini or Rage's Berserk. He even said right on the forum, there is no tech, maybe it's going to be available in the future. Doesn't mean it's an exploit. It means that the artifact is working as intended, because there were no other tech available to make it act differently. So same thing with like for the Mercy one, just in this example, like say I had Scrap on, I want to summon a pet, so you're going to switch to Mercy, you're going to use your first pet, then if I went back to Scrap, and then use a power, whichever, and then I want to swap back to that to hit my henchman, then I hit my henchman, and it'll proc again. So, like, for example, let me just quickly get it at combat here so you can see the logs. So the Mercy Strike was 760k, and then my second Mercy Strike, 760. The first one was like 313. So yes, it reset the internal cooldown by swapping the artifact. And I mean, once again, if it's technically how it's intended. I mean, if the developers want to add some tech later so that when you swap, it doesn't reset the internal cooldown, that's fine. But it doesn't mean we're exploiting the artifact. We're just using it how it's intended. It's intended each time when summoning a trinket pack damages nearby enemies. It doesn't mention anything about only like the internal cooldown is something that's not shared. It's just built in the artifact. So if I take the artifact off, obviously it's going to reset the internal cooldown because the artifact's not equipped anymore. So it's just, that's how artifacts work. It's the same thing with flute. So if I put flute on, so we've got flute equipped. If I hit a power and then take, we're going to take flute off, swap it back onto scrap, and then I go and use my powers again. I've got time to hit a supercharge to have the effect proc. So if I hit scrap, now that you see all the rats procking. But I didn't have flute equipped because once I equip flute and hit a power, it basically waits for a supercharge to be used, and then you can use it after the fact. So you don't actually have to have flute on to be able to proc it. You just have to equip it, hit a power, you can swap back off and like to scrap so that you get the supercharge regen. You know, is that an exploit? No, that's how the artifact works. Doesn't mean in the future that it couldn't be changed. They could certainly make it so that the flute has to be equipped to be able to have the proc on the supercharge, which would be fine. Players would adapt to it. So that's the thing. I mean, we're going to adapt to whatever they do with artifacts because at the same time, we have like 40 plus artifacts. So there's no reason to basically negate, like people want to like locked artifact swapping or make it so you can't artifact swap at all, or have it like an inventory like allies where you have to like equip your artifacts from here, which obviously would not make swappable even possible. But you, at the same time, then you're killing off like 3/4 of your investment. So if I'm a DPS and can't swap artifacts, why would I ever use scrap or flute or mercy or dead king or like tetra or philosopher's stone or even solar? I wouldn't use scrap. Like you basically lock yourself into like 3 artifacts, E-bomb, amulet. Like there's so many different artifacts for DPS combinations. Even for tanks, like tanks, you'd have your main 3, but then you wouldn't be able to swap, like say Lazarus pit on for certain situations. So it's just people are getting overly concerned by thinking that every single player is using it. Like the clip you'll see from Encoded where he's basically swapping off amulet. So for example, that's another thing I want to mention. It's not even exploiting. It's just smart gameplay at that point. So if we have, say, he does it with Dead King, but I'll show an example of scrap. Like if I'm building my stacks with amulet, if I use a finisher, then it's going to reset my stacks, and then I go back to 1. I don't want that as a might DPS. I mean, I want to be able to use my finisher because it's high damage, but I don't want it to reset my stacks all the time. Not if I have a healer in the group or E-bomb with like a controller. So if I do heat vision and then say like freezing breath, whatever, I'm just building my stacks up at that point. And then when I wanted to use the finisher, I can swap off that finisher from amulet, use my finisher, put amulet back on, and then I can keep the stacks. Well, I'm going to die because of the stacks, but that's what I'm doing. So I'm swapping off Lineara's amulet whenever I have to use a finisher just before, like say on heat vision or another channel power. And then I can swap off amulet to keep my stacks going in a raid without having them drop. That's just smart gameplay. And I mean, even smarter that Code had found that with Dead King would reset the orbital assistance. I mean, when I use that with amulet, I would just use scrap or like another artifact. I would never have thought to use Dead King, but it's the same thing. So the reason why that'd be an issue with might DPS is because of scrap. I mean, people swapping strat is awkward for might DPS because it cancels your channel. So you have to wait for the right timing at the end of your channel, and it just becomes bothersome. So that's where usually I would spot trap and just kind of wait to the end of heat vision or wait to the end of my channel so I didn't lose damage. But if you're doing it quickly enough, then you basically just cancel it. So, that's not you're not exploiting Lineara's amulet. You're just using it. You want to maintain it, but you don't want the finisher to reset it. So then you just take the artifact off and then use your finisher so it doesn't reset the stacks and continue on. I mean, that's just smart DPSing. You have to, finishers are the main source of single target damage for my DPS. I shouldn't be restricted or hindered by missing out on that damage and resetting my stacks and then having to wait to build 10 stacks again with either Amulet or E-Bomb just so that I want to get the finisher damage. And he found it that where you could just use orbital assistance and keep getting that. So basically it's more beneficial to get some extra damage out of it. But that's all it is. So like I said, you don't have to art swap. I've said this a bunch of times in various videos and guides. You don't have to art swap to be complete content. I mean, you can complete any sort of Elite Plus or Elite content without artifact swapping or just keeping a primary 3 on. Art swapping just gives you the opportunity to kind of expand on your DPS and make it more challenging. It is going to be in your inventory all the time. I mean, if you're doing that swap on Amulet each time, that's every like 4 seconds you have to swap that. So every 4 seconds you'd have to be in your inventory swapping onto Dead King for that extra damage. Are some players going to want to do that? Sure. I mean, all the power to them. Is that something you should be expected every single raid you go into? Of course not. I mean, I don't even do that. I think the controller like 10, 11 artifact swap rotation is ridiculous. That's why I'm Quantum, so I don't have to use Bop, Parasite, or Rings. So it's just, it's whatever your comfortable level is. It doesn't mean that you get to like dictate or change what other players are doing because you don't want to do that. So if I don't want to art swap every 4 seconds, it doesn't mean that I should try to get this nerfed, or I should say, well, you're exploiting or cheating. No, I mean, that's all the power to those players that want to do that. It doesn't mean that I get to dictate how they get to play, because that's how artifacts work right now. Could that change in the future? Sure. The developers could have the technology to change that, but to drastically change artifact swapping or remove it altogether, I mean, you're just going to hurt the player base. You're going to hurt the DPSing in general, and obviously you're going to hurt your wallet as well, because we have 40 artifacts, and if you remove artifact swapping, then like 35 of them are useless. So I know this is always a topic of conversation. Let's continue this in the comment section, and I want to see how you guys feel. So take care. We'll see you in the next video.